The value of learning lots of different Qigong practices. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So I think I'll start out by just being very clear that it's not always necessary to learn a whole lot of different Qigong practices. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite is true. Sometimes we get much more benefit by focusing on just a single set of practices, or even just a single individual practice or movement just by itself. In fact, this is often the approach when working with Qigong therapeutically, where we aim to identify, what's the one specific thing that is going to really help someone, and then they get far more benefit by just doing that one thing rather than also doing a whole lot of other things as well. They do more of the thing that you really need. So that's in a therapeutic sense. And then similarly, even in terms of sets of Qigong practices, huge value comes from just going deeper and deeper and deeper into the same set of practices. It might not be a single movement or a single practice, it might be a whole set of them. But as you go and spend more time with them and go deeper and deeper, new nuances come to the surface, you understand them better, new different benefits come more clearly to the fore, you develop more skill. And so that can be a hugely rewarding and beneficial process. And there's often more benefit in doing that than there is in doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit, and getting too distracted by doing too many different Qigong practices. But, as is often the case, when something is true, in a sense, the opposite, or something kind of like the opposite, is also true. This is one of the principles. Hey, I'm wearing an appropriate shirt for this one today. I've got a nice little Taiji too, a yin-yang symbol here. And when we start to understand Taiji, the harmony between opposites, harmony between yin and yang, which is a really core part of Chinese philosophy, we start to understand how things that are opposite or seem to be opposite, well, they are actually opposite. That doesn't mean they're in conflict with each other. In fact, often, again, both of them can be true, both of them can be right, and there's actually a harmony between them. They support each other. There's, and this is true as well. There's often benefit in focusing just on one practice, one set of practices, but there's also a whole lot of other benefits that come from learning a wide variety of different Qigong practices. So I'll go through some of those benefits as well, because within the Long White Cloud Qigong, which is, so this is the Chi Life channel, but you probably mainly know that Long White Cloud Qigong is my Qigong school, and that's what I spend a vast majority of my time on, teaching people Qigong. Within the Long White Cloud Qigong syllabus, we teach a wide range of practices. And there's more that I will teach in the future that I sort of haven't got around to teaching yet, because there is so many of them and they are so beneficial in different ways. Some of the practices we teach, or the major practices, because there's lots of little additional ones as well. We teach the small universe Qigong practices, which work with, essentially it focuses on the flows of energy within our body, which mirrors very much the flow of water in the planet around us. So the rain, the rivers, the gathering into the oceans, the ocean currents, and then circulating back out into the clouds and rain in the atmosphere, and different practices that work with those, and that relates to the organ meridians, the dantians, the extraordinary meridians, the energy fields, and so on. So, these are great practices, and a whole lot of value within each one of those practices. There's, a whole series of them within that same set of practices. There's waking the chi, which activates the energy. There's the 12 rivers, which works with the organ meridians. There's between heaven and earth, which works with the dantian and with the extraordinary meridians, and then into the flow, that works more specifically with the energy field and the free circulation of energy, like the clouds and rain. So there's a whole lot just within that. And then we also have the inner fire Qigong practices, which are more dynamic practices, working with inner fire breath work, wild animal play practices, very much inspired by wild animals, very dynamic practices. Iron Shirt Qigong as well, which is connected to the martial arts, but has huge health benefits as well, a whole lot of breathing practices. And then there's the Elemental Alchemy Qigong program, which in there we teach practices to do with Wuji, the formless, the primordial, Taiji, here again, so yin and yang, polarity, and creating dynamic circulation from that polarity. And then Wuxing, the 5 elements, the 5 phases, and practices that work with each of those. So those are just some of the main practices, and then there's a whole lot of additional ones, and more and more direct healing practices, like so many different practices. So clearly I'm teaching more than just one practice, one set of practices. So I wouldn't do it if there wasn't some benefit to, having this broader view, moving beyond just a single set or single practice. Again, that's really valuable in a specific context at times. Again, for a therapeutic benefit, sometimes to just go deep because you want a depth of understanding, or sometimes just as a process of learning and experiencing to go deeper. So why learn a whole lot of Qigong practices? There's a few reasons. So one is just the understanding that different practices give us. Now, within all of those practices I just mentioned, or really category headings of practices, because there's many practices within each, within each of them, there's a whole lot of principles combined, a whole lot of Qigong principles. And in fact, you can see pretty much all of the principles within one practice if you dig deep enough. But naturally also, each of those practices focuses more directly on a particular set of principles. And then a different set of practices will focus more directly on another set of principles. So for example, the 12 Rivers Qigong practice, which is in the Small Universe Qigong program, it focuses very much on working with the organ meridians. That's its direct focus. Now, within that, there's lots of other principles to do with mindfulness, awareness, breathing, posture, all of these other things. There's 5 elements involved there as well, all of that's there. But it has this very direct focus on the organ meridians. And so by doing and focusing, learning that set of practices, you learn a lot about the organ meridians, you develop a lot of awareness, and it really brings, your understanding and your experiential knowledge of the meridians out. You get a lot more detail from doing that. But then if you do a different set of practices, so for example, some of the practices in the Elemental Alchemy program, if you do some of the Wuxing, the 5 element practices, in those practices, again, all these principles are at play there. Within those 5 element practices, you'll find stimulation and activation of the meridians, similar to what we did in the 12 rivers. But that's not the main focus. There's a much more direct focus on the qualities of the 5 elements and how the practices develop this overall quality within our energy. When you do those Wuxing, those 5 element practices, if you've already practiced the 12 rivers, you're going to just straight away, much more easily, as well as noticing the 5 element qualities within the practices, you're going to also notice what's happening with the meridians, because you've developed a lot of understanding and awareness of those. Similarly, if you've already done the 12 rivers practice and you do those Wuxing, those 5 element practices, and then you come back to doing those 12 rivers again, you'll now be able to observe much more clearly, much more easily, the role of the 5 elements and what's happening with those within the 12 rivers practices. It was there all along, but having directly focused on it with another set of practices, it now brings that detail out to you more. And the same goes with other practices as well. This is just one example, organ meridians, 5 elements. Other principles, working with the dantians, it's done in different ways in different practices, some with a more direct focus than others, working with the extraordinary meridians, working with different aspects of breath, and so on. By doing practices that focus more directly on each of these principles, little by little, our understanding becomes much richer, even within a single practice. So that's one of the benefits of doing lots of different practices. They each give us a different perspective on Qigong as a whole, and in many ways I'd say life as a whole, or our living energy as a whole, and so it rounds out our understanding, and even within one practice it becomes much richer. So some other reasons why it's beneficial to learn a whole lot of different Qigong practices. One is that it actually just gives you variety, which can be quite nice, particularly if you're practicing Qigong over a long period of time. Months, years, decades, maybe your whole life. Sometimes it's nice to have different things to work with. I think you can compare this, as I often do, I like to make different analogies, to eating food. Now, if you've got a good balanced diet, there's nothing wrong with having a pretty consistent diet where you eat pretty similar things, all the time, for different meals, if it's meeting your needs. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it's certainly enjoyable to be able to have some different options to eat, at least from time to time when you feel like it, or sometimes to just go through phases where you're like, you know what, I'm enjoying eating this type of food more at the moment, which is also very healthy for me. Yeah. Having that variety of different things available to you also helps you to be able to get exactly what you need at different times. And this can be, again, analogy between eating food and your Qigong practice holds pretty well, because you might be, doing practices that are pretty good for you, doing most of what you need, but there might be just a few things, or similar with your diet, you're like, yeah, you're getting most of what you need, but there's just something that you need a little bit more of. And by having a variety of different practices, you can fill in and go like, oh, I got that little thing that I needed more of from this practice, which I wasn't maybe getting as fully from these other practices that I was doing regularly. So that can both be just enjoyable and also to make sure, you're getting a balance of all the things you need. This then becomes really, really important or specifically useful in a therapeutic context. As I mentioned right at the beginning, sometimes, from a therapeutic perspective, we're actually much better to focus on a single practice and really do a lot of that to get the benefit that we need. But how do we choose which single practice? Now, it's true for a lot of things. There's a whole variety of practices that might be useful for helping, whatever the issue is. But for some things that might be affecting our life or our health and we want to address therapeutically, some practices are going to be much more specifically targeted to help us with that specifically. And knowing a wide range of different practices is going to help us to find one that is going to target what we need much more clearly and give us the benefit that we need. Another analogy for this is a bit like someone like having tools, like literally tools in a toolkit. If you're just someone who, maybe in your house, you want to be able to do a few very basic repairs for yourself because it's a real hassle or maybe expensive to have to get someone else to do them to come in to do them. Well, often just having a very few tools in a toolkit is really useful because it lets you do a few basic things. You might have a hammer and a spanner and a screwdriver and, so you can do a few basic things yourself. And that might be enough for your needs. But for some jobs, you won't have the tools that you need. And in that instance, you might need to get in someone who's a bit more of a specialist, who has a much wider range of tools at their disposal, and they have the tool to get the job done that you need within your home. And so that the same thing applies in terms of Qigong. You don't necessarily need to have heaps and heaps and heaps of different Qigong practices, but how many different Qigong practices you want to learn will depend on, well, at least to one thing, how deeply you want to get involved with Qigong and to what extent you want to use it in your life. Just for some general enjoyment and health and well-being, just learning a few practices might be enough. But if you're wanting a wider range of tools to address a wider range of situations in your own life, or possibly to help others, having more tools is a really useful thing. So you can tailor and have the right tool for the job to be able to do things better. And again, some people, this is a case of that's their profession. If you go into a mechanic's workshop, they have all the different tools that they need, industrial quality, heavy duty tools for doing whatever they need to, because they use them all the time, every day. They need different tools specific for the job. Other people, if you go into their garage, they might have just a few tools for a few basic things, or it might be that they just really like working on cars, and so even though it's not their job, it's just something they do because they enjoy it. They might have a whole lot of different tools because they like to be able to do things for themselves. So you can apply that same principle to Qigong as well. You know, you don't necessarily need a whole lot of different practices. Maybe having some variety is useful, but you might want to learn a lot more either because of developing that knowledge and skill to help others, or simply because you enjoy it as well. Anyway, hopefully that's given you a few ideas about why it's useful to learn a whole lot of different Qigong practices. As I said at the beginning, it's certainly by no means necessary. It depends on what you're wanting to do with your Qigong, what you're wanting to get out of it. And it's certainly important, if you are learning Qigong practices, to give each one that you learn enough time to really understand and appreciate it. Because if you don't do that, like, even though you've learned it, you might not really understand it and you're not really going to get the benefit. So you don't want to rush that process of learning them more. But over time, if you are continuing to practice Qigong for quite some time, you'll reach a point where you're like, okay, I really love these practices that I'm doing. I find a lot of benefit from them. It's really great. But you might be like, I'd like to try something new. I'd like to expand my knowledge. And then you can take something else on. Take your time, learn it properly. And then once you've taken that in, you're like, okay, maybe at some point down the track, you might want to learn some more as well. Great thing with Qigong is there's so much diversity, so many different practices that you can learn. As I mentioned, there's a whole lot just within the Long White Cloud Qigong syllabus and more that I will teach in the future. I like to really make sure that I like to teach the practice as well. I like to have comprehensive course materials so I can explain things clearly and so on. And so it takes me quite a bit of time often before I have new materials ready to teach. I don't just like spit them out. So they come available from time to time as I'm ready to be able to do a good job of that. But yeah, so over time there'll be more available. And so yeah, just within Long White Cloud Qigong syllabus there's heaps. But then beyond that, there's literally thousands of other Qigong styles as well that you could choose to learn and draw from and gain a huge amount of benefit from. All right, I hope you've enjoyed the vlog. If you have, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things. And I look forward to seeing you in another one soon.